Yo guys, what is up? Here we are with another reading video, and we've got some announcements to do before we go into the chapters. So you guys have responded to my questions, and as you guys have asked, I am going to do 2 chapters at once. We're going to try it out, see how you guys like it. Comment down below if you want me to switch back to the singles, or you like how this is. So the bad thing about this is that these videos are going to be much longer. Good thing is that it means that we're going to get through this book much faster, and we're probably going to be able to do another book, so in that case, I need you guys to already start commenting down below what's the next book you want me to read. Now, without further ado, let's get right into the story. Lost in the Pacific, 1942, by Todd Olson. Chapter 7, To Catch a Fish. On the morning of the 4th day at sea, Rickenbacker divided the second orange and passed the meager sections around. By this time, Bartek, DeAngelis, Reynolds, and Alex had gone close to 96 hours with nothing but an eighth of an orange to eat. Under normal circumstances, they took in 2,500 calories a day. In the last 4 days, they had consumed 20. Under their reddening skin, blood and liver, muscles and brain waged a battle against starvation. On a normal diet, the body converts food into glucose, a form of sugar, and consumes it for energy. The men had exhausted the supply of food in their bodies 3 days ago. Since then, their cells have been burning stored fat for energy instead of glucose. Already, their faces had begun to thin. Bones looked a little more prominent. Now their bodies dug deeper for fuel. Their vital organs harvested protein from muscle tissue in order to keep functioning. Without a new supply of fuel, each man's body was literally consuming itself to stay alive. Rickenbacker's speech to the men took on a different tone this morning. "You might as well sit down and prepare for a long ride," he told them. They would end up on an island somewhere if they drifted long enough. There was no question in his mind about that. The challenge would be to survive until they did. The men were fast discovering the cruel irony behind them being stranded in the ocean. They were starving, and yet they were surrounded by food. The water teemed with sleek, silvery fish, from tiny fingerlings to foot-long jack mackerel and plump-looking dolphins. Seabirds circled overhead, diving occasionally to catch their lunch. The men seemed to have attracted their own traveling ecosystem, but all of it lay just beyond their reach. They had fish hooks and line. Without food, they had no bait. Without bait, they had no food. The orange peels had held no interest at all for the fish. Rickenbacker tried adding Adamson's shiny keychain as a lure. Whitaker tied his ring to a line and sunk it. Sometimes a fish would get curious and hover near a hook, so close the men could almost taste it. Each time, it would lose interest and dart away. They debated trying to turn the tables on the sharks and convert the fearsome predators into prey. Sherry could probably put a bullet into one of them at close range. But if he didn't kill it, what would happen? The wounded creature would flail around, trailing blood in the water. Imagine the 12-foot monster thrashing around the rafts, whipped into a frenzy by the scent of blood. They decided it was best to let the sharks be. The seabirds were another source of frustration. At first they had seemed a surefire sign that land was near. Now it was clear the men had misunderstood the habits of seabirds. These creatures were perfectly at home many miles from land. They taunted the men, darting and hovering in sight, but well out of reach. It's not as though the scrawny birds would be much of a meal, but if they could just get their hands on one, they might be able to use the meat for bait. Sherry kept his .45 caliber pistol in his lap during the day. Every now and then he'd take a shot, but he never came close to hitting a bird. Bartek tormented himself by watching the birds fish. They'd flap low, scanning for prey, then drop with a splash. An instant later, they rose with a meal. Just like that. Bartek wasn't normally much of a philosopher, but his sister's death and now his own close encounter with the end had pushed his mind to a dark place. All around them, creatures with brains no bigger than the tip of Bartek's little finger found food with ease. Here they were, 8 members of the smartest species on Earth. Between them, they had decades of education and specialized training. Bartek himself knew how to fix some of the most complex machines ever made. But out here, it was all meaningless. All they could do was pray that a careless bird might drop a fish in their laps. Day 4 turned to 5, and 5 to 6. Amundsen could barely move his arms, but each day he scratched the date onto the side of the raft. October 24th, October 25th, October 26th. The men started passing Bartek's Bible around and choosing passages to read. Whitaker mostly kept his mouth shut when they did. He wasn't a believer. What good was praying going to do? They were on their own out here. Each night they set up flares until they got one to work. When it burned out and left them in darkness, it made them feel like the only people left in the world. On the fifth morning, they gave up on Rickenbacker's rationing plan and ate the third orange. It was dry. It was dry as the inside of their mouths. The last one started to rot, and they devoured it on the sixth day. Now the real torture set in. For the first few days, they'd had at least something to look forward to. Even if it was a tasteless piece of orange they could eat in one bite. By the time the sun baked off the chill of the fifth night and began to roast them alive, they had nothing left but a relentless need for food. They were desperately thirsty, too. But right now, it was hunger that held them captive every waking minute of the day. As if they could lay out their fantasies on a table and carve them up, the men dreamed up 5-course meals in their heads and shared with one another. Captain Sherry posed as a waiter as one of San Francisco's finest restaurants. He went around the rafts taking orders. There was always fruit juice to start, then steaks and roasts and chops and turkey. Everyone wanted lemon. Their bodies were starving for vitamin C. The milkshakes from the Officers' Club at Hickam Field were in high demand, and strawberry was the flavor of choice. If they ever got off the rafts, they agreed, they'd all have one another for dinner. Bartek offered up his mother's Polish meatballs and cabbage, with apple pie for dessert. Daniel said his mother would make spaghetti. Reynolds invited everyone to his parents' ranch in Northern California, where they'd feast on fried chicken, followed by cake and pie. Bartek managed to keep his sense of humor for a while. When the men in the Air Transport Command traveled, they collected $6 a day from the Army for expenses. One thing about being lost at sea, Bartek said, the expenses were pretty light. He ended up every day tallying up their earnings. Well, he said, that's another $6 for us. It was good for a few laughs, but nothing to keep their minds off food for long. Rickenbacker watched with irritation as hunger and exhaustion tore away at the morale of the crew. Simple tasks took some heroic effort, and the rafts required constant attention. Between the sea spray and tiny leaks in the canvas, water collected incessantly. INCESSANTLY. Comment down below if you know what the heck that means. At their feet. To stay afloat, everyone had to help bail out the rafts. They used collapsible rubber buckets and sometimes their hats to shovel water back into the sea, only to watch it fill the bottom of the rafts again. When they weren't bailing, someone was laboring over the hand pump. Wow. Trying to keep invisible leaks from deflating the rafts. During the first couple of days, it was a 15-minute task to get the side tubes fully blown up. Now, one man had trouble finishing it without handing the pump over to a raft mate and collapsing from fatigue. It was hard work just staying afloat, and the men were beginning to wonder if there was any point in doing it. Despite Rickenbacker's pep talks, Daniels had decided after the third day that they were pretty much doomed. Pain had turned Amundsen into a bitter, grumbling lump in the corner of Rickenbacker's raft. Radio man Jim Reynolds, who was thin to begin with, had started to waste away. He said barely a word and looked like he wouldn't last long without food. Sergeant Alex was the worst of the lot. A white paste had formed at the corners of his mouth. He sat in the donut and moaned for water or mumbled the name of his girlfriend over and over. Her name was Snooks, and it took a while for the men to figure out what he was talking about. Finally, Rickenbacker got tired of listening to the moaning. In his mind, despair was a contagious disease, and Alex was showing symptoms. They were going to survive out here. Everyone had to believe it was not just possible, but certain. Any sign of doubt had to be stamped out quickly and ruthlessly. No one could be allowed to quit. He rolled the donut in close and lashed out at Alex. "Why the... can't you take it?" he demanded. After all, Alex wasn't the only one suffering, and there was thousands more boys out there fighting for their lives in unbearable conditions. American soldiers stuck in waterlogged foxholes eating meager rations of rice and beans. Alex explained meekly that he'd been recovering from jaundice and appendicitis. He'd only been out of the hospital for a couple of weeks, and he'd gotten some kind of lip or gum infection. He also admitted he'd been leaning over the side of the donut and drinking the salt water. I tried not to, but I had to, he moaned. I just had to have water. Rickenbacker turned away and let the donut drift back to the end of its 20-foot tether. They better find food and water soon, he thought, or Alex wasn't going to make it. Hunger filled the empty hours of the day and night. Their mind groped for solutions, real or imagined. At one point, Sherry was baiting a hook with yet another useless piece of orange when he wondered out loud if fingernails would work. Bartek said no, it would take a real piece of flesh to make a fish bite. What part would you use? Asked Whitaker. Bartek claimed he used an earlobe because they don't serve any purpose. You'd never miss it, he said. Whitaker suggested the tip of a finger. Reynolds wanted to use a piece of a toe because no one would ever notice it was missing. It started as idle chatter, but everyone knew it was a real option. They needed bait, and if they had to use their own flesh, shouldn't they do it? Amundsen warned the blood from a fingertip or an earlobe might aggravate the sharks. That didn't seem to be like much of a threat after a week at sea with their constant companions, but no one was quite ready to slice off an earlobe for the chance of catching a fish. Their conversation passed with all body parts intact. The talk of using human flesh as bait, however, brought them uncomfortably close to a last-ditch measure that no one was willing to mention aloud. At sea, when men grew desperate enough, they had been known to eat one another to survive. In 1820, the whale ship Essex was ran by a giant sperm whale about 2,500 miles east of where the three rafts were now drifting. In 3 months lost at sea, the 8 survivors of the Essex consumed 7 of their companions. In one case, they didn't even wait for a boatmate to die. They drew lots, and the unlucky sailor who picked the short stick was sacrificed for a meal. They drew again to decide who would shoot him. The practice was common enough that it was part of an unwritten code known as the custom of the sea. As long as the lots were drawn fairly, no court of law considered it murder. Most heroes had to be on the verge of death before they resorted to cannibalism, but everyone had a different threshold. It took the castaways from the Essex 2 months before they started saving dead bodies for food. In 1884, the crew of the English yacht Minot lasted 20 days before they killed and ate their 17-year-old cabin boy. Rickenbacker, Whitaker, and Bartek and the rest of the crew had now been adrift for a week. The names of the B-17, Chapter 8, Out of the Sky. The names of the B-17 crews were released on October 25th, 5 days after the plane vanished. The Army and the Navy were using every available plane to search for the men. But by now, the papers were declaring them and their famous passenger lost for good. Only a wisp of hope, reported the Lewiston Tribune in Idaho. A star has vanished, decreed the Gallatin Times in Alabama. The Wichita Beacon in Kansas left no doubt at all. Rickenbacker death, a serious blow, read its headline on October 27th, 6 days after the men disappeared. Rickenbacker's close friends and relatives weren't ready to write him off yet. They spoke to reporters or wrote letters to editors insisting that Eddie would survive this close call, just like he had survived the others. But most reporters retold the stories of Whitaker's life as though they were speaking at his funeral. Nearly everyone agreed that the world had lost a great American. According to the papers, Eddie was a role model. He was a hero at a time when Americans needed heroes. He stood for values that seemed especially important to a nation at war. Eddie was a man of action. No swivel chair for him, but the pilot's seat and the roar of a motor, wrote one reporter. There's a picture and it says, Leadfoot Ed. Rickenbacker at the wheel of a race car, not long before he went overseas in World War I. You can probably look up the pictures online, or, just get the book yourself. Eddie believed in progress. He raced automobiles in the days when just one in 50 Americans owned one. He flew military missions at a time when planes had been around for barely more than a decade. He started a commercial airline when most people were too scared to set foot on a plane. Eddie wasn't afraid to take risks. In his racing days, a newspaper called him Leadfoot Ed because he knew only one way to race. Floor it until you either crash or win or crash. According to an Illinois paper, he was the bravest of the brave. Now it appeared he was gone forever. Eddie had been a meteor, blazing his way across the horizon of human achievement, gushed the reporter from the Gadsden Times. His star rose and dazzled during the First World War, and the shining arc of it swept into the war of the present, finally to be smothered in the spume of the restless Pacific. Back on the rafts, Rickenbacker's star was merely dozing when a small seabird, a swallow or a tern, circled the group, came unusually low in the sky, and landed on his hat. Eddie awoke. The bird looked around at the gaunt creatures in front of him. They stared back. No one spoke. No one moved. Rickenbacker saw the greed in the eyes of his raft mates, and he knew exactly what had happened. He raised his right hand as slowly as he could bear. He touched his chin. He raised his hand higher. When it reached the brim of his hat, he made a blind grab for the bird, clamped his fingers around its legs, trapped its body with his other hand, and hung on as though 8 lives depended on it. The bird could not have weighed more than 3 ounces, but it was food, and more importantly, bait. Rickenbacker wrung the bird's neck and plucked it as feathers. He carved out the intestines and set them aside. Then he carefully cut the rest of the 8 equal pieces of dark, snowy meat. The men devoured the tiny bites raw, bones and all. Aside from the 4 bites of orange they had so carefully rationed, it was the first food to cross their lips in nearly 200 hours. The morsels of bird meat were just enough to make their mouths water for more. Rickenbacker handed a slimy piece of seabird intestine into the other large raft. 2 baited hooks went overboard, and 8 pairs of eyes stared after them. It didn't take long for the dead bird to serve its purpose. Sherry's boat hauled in a fish about 8 to 12 inches long. Rickenbacker caught another about the same size. The men carved the first fish into portions, an inch square and half-inch thick. They agreed to store the second fish for the next day's meal. Rickenbacker thought he could feel the mood in the rafts lighten. The tiny chunks of raw fish tasted cool and moist, one of the most delicious things he had ever eaten. Even Alex and Amundsen, in all their misery, seemed to revive when the food hit their tongue. Best of all, the crew had proven they could use their own resourcefulness to survive. They had reached into the vast ocean and plucked food from it. With patience and a little ingenuity, they had turned their prison into a pantry. That there was an unlimited supply of fish in the sea, and it was theirs for the taking. The food had a noticeably different effect on Whitaker's mood. He enjoyed his 2-course meal of tern and fish, but as soon as he finished, another craving took over. His mouth was pasty and dry, his head throbbed. It felt like the sun was baking every last drop of moisture out of him. The late afternoon air cooled and brought some relief. But when the sun finally dropped to the horizon, the colors in the sky tormented Whitaker. All he could think of was the expression he drank in the sunset. The red would be strawberry, the yellow lemon, and the purple grape. And he wanted it all with plenty of ice. The fact was that the people had been known to survive 2, even 3 months without food. Rarely did anyone last for 2 weeks without water. And that is the end of the 2 chapters. So I hope you guys enjoyed this version. Make sure to leave a comment if you did. Put a big thumbs up and hit that subscribe button. And I'll see you guys in the next video.